Before we get started this week with poly modeling, I wanted to run through in this video how to model something complex and maybe representational using curves and surfaces. So I thought I would model for you a tree. And to start, I'll start with a curve. I'm going to go to my orthographic front view. And I'm also going to be using these snapping tools a bit. And the first one I'm going to use is Snap to Grid. Snap to Grid allows me to place the points of my curve directly on the grid. And so to make a tree, I'll start at the center origin and I'll maybe go up, 15 or so units, hit enter. Now, right now I only have 2 edit points on my curve. So in order to add more points, I can go to curve and rebuild. And now it's saying the number of spans I want to rebuild. So how many more edit points along this curve would I like to add? I think this is important to note too if you're using the Bezier curve tool and then you go to convert it to edit points. To then maybe rebuild the curve to add more spans, to add more edit points, so that you can maintain a better shaped curve. I don't know if you remember last week when we were working with the Bezier curves, there weren't enough edit points to really imply a true curve. So to go to rebuild the curve options, maybe I'm going to say I want about 20 spans, and I'm going to say rebuild. Let me select my curve to do it. And now when I go to my edit points, you can see that I've rebuilt this curve with 20 edit points. The next thing I want to do is I want to reposition my pivot to be at the very base of the tree. So to do that, I'll hit W, and in order to bring up the move tool, and I'll hit D. And because I'm snapping to grid, I should be able to snap this right down at the very base. So grab that center. And I'm going to hit D again. And now I have my pivot in the correct place. So let's give this will be the trunk of the tree. So I will, let's build a circle. And I'm going to scale this down a bit. I can see the diameter of the circle, so maybe 0.8. And now it's a little bit smaller. And so to generate the trunk, I'll select the circle and select the curve, and then go to surfaces, extrude. Okay, now I have a trunk of the tree. And now I want to do some edits to the curves themselves so that I'm able to generate a bit more of an organic form. The first thing is this circle should be a bit smaller. So remember, we can still edit our curves themselves, and they will be applied to the surface. And now with my curve selected, I'm going to go up to curves and I'm going to say curl, bring up my curl options. And that's a bit too much. Let's go back to curl and just play with some of the options here, the curl frequency and the curl amount. Maybe increase the frequency. And so I can kind of just play with this until I have a little bit of a wavy line. Now my extruded surface is pulling away from the curve, so let's go to the extrude 1 node here and put this along a fixed path. And also I want you can see at the bottom here, I do want my trunk to lay flat on the ground, so I'm going to use profile normal. Okay, so now I have a bit of a kind of wavy trunk. Now trunks usually taper. And to taper this, extrude, I'm going to use a deformer. And deformers, there's a couple here. We're going to use these nonlinear deformers. And the first one we're going to use is flare. So this is a way to deform a model by applying a function to it. So let's bring up our flare options here, or let's actually just apply the flare. And now you see I have this flare handle that's appeared in my outliner. So these are my controls, and they're being applied to the surface. You can see that my flare node is attached to my extrude node. And so here are our attributes that we can adjust. I think the end in both directions I'd like to taper. To about, let's just type in a value of 2.2. And I'm also going to increase the bounds, not the high bound, but the low bound. So this changes, at what position the flare or the deformer is applied to the model. Okay, so I like the way that looks. So that's the trunk of our tree. And we can go to our perspective view, and now we can see that we have the trunk. A really important thing, so that you don't have your outliner cluttered with a lot of transform or operational nodes, like the flare handle, for example, right? And you can see it here as it's indicated as a kind of object in the scene. What you're going to want to do with your models, if you're using curves and surfaces, but definitely when you're polymodeling, you're going to want to delete the history of that model. And you can see here in our outliner that we have a bunch of nodes, but we also have these transform nodes, the flare and the extrude, for example. But if I start to edit any components, I'll have more and more nodes, which are all transform history nodes that are popping up attached to the model. And this can be handy if you want to go back and make edits to operations that you've applied to your model. But most of the time we don't need these. Once we have our model, the form, and we're happy with it, rather than clicking through what ends up being a pretty long extended list of nodes, and especially if you're trying to get to the end and get to your shader node or material node, you're going to want to delete the history. So to delete history, we're going to select our extrude surface. We're going to go up to Edit, Delete All by Type, and History. Now you can choose what kind of history you want to delete. I'm going to delete all by type. And now you can see that our flare object in our outliner is gone. It's no longer appearing here in the scene. And it's also, we have, again, our 4 main nodes. So you'll always have these 4 nodes. You'll have your global transform node, you'll have your shape node, your shader node, and your material node. Okay, so that's perfect. Now this model is becoming like cleaner. Let's add some branches. So let's generate some branch forms. We can do the same if we want some different shapes. We can easily generate more interesting forms, but for the sake of time, by using a curve node, just like we did, and then a circle, and then extruding along it. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to Command D to duplicate my trunk, and let's move it over a bit. And then I'm going to scale. I'm going to scale it down, and I'm also going to scale it in the Z and X directions to make it a little bit skinnier. And now I'm going to apply, let's lengthen it a bit. I'm going to apply another node, and that will be another nonlinear deformer, and this time we're going to use bend. So again, applying bend, I see now a bend handle has been added, and I can bend it's bending in this direction. I can bend my model, and I will also push up the low bound. So maybe something like this. And I can also move, I can change the direction of the handle. I can rotate it around so it's applying differently. If I rotate the handle itself, it will apply differently to the model. I can also move it, hit W and move it down or up. So something like this maybe. And so now I have a bit of a bend applied to this first branch. Once I like the way this looks, I'm going to select the model itself and then edit, delete all by type history. And so now I have a branch. So I'll add more branches to this branch just by command duplicate. Maybe I'll apply another bend for a twig. And I might want to rotate this bend handle so that I'm applying it. Tool settings here, and so I want to change my axis orientation. I'm going to go to Object, and I'm going to move this bend handle, and I'm going to want to actually turn off here this snap to grid function. I can and move it on top of, I'm going to hit F to frame it up, collapse these tool settings for a minute, rotate around and make sure that it's positioned, you know, relatively in line with the original bend. And now I'll go to my my bend node here, maybe change the low bounds again, and then bend my curve. And it's bending now in this direction, and I'm going to rotate in the Y. So something like this, and then again maybe move, maybe less of a bend. So I have some kind of branch here. Maybe move this up a bit. Okay. I'm going to go back to my outliner and for the third time, edit, delete all by type history. Again, scale this down. So now what I'd like to do is I have my twig and my branch and my tree. So what I'll do is I will duplicate this branch, and this time I'm going to say snap to point, and I'm going to use my move tool, hit W and select the center, and I'm going to let's see, maybe try snap to curve as well, and I think it just might not like, I would like to snap to this surface. So it's not snapping to, let's see if we can snap it to surface points perhaps, but it's not recognizing surface points. So I think those two, there we are, now it is. Okay, so now it's on my surface and it's snapping to the surface. It's recognizing the surface, and now I'm snapping to the surface. I will duplicate another branch, and now it's moving up this surface. I would like it to be attached over here. So I just moved it in the X axis, and then it recognized my branch. So I have a couple twigs here, and because I've changed the pivot point to the very base initially when I built my trunk, now I'm able to rotate at that pivot point. So I can kind of build this tree much easier. And I'm going to scale, hit R and scale this down. So everything will be in relation to that base so that it makes it easier for me to generate these forms in relation to each other. Let's go ahead and rotate this out. Okay. So, and maybe I'll attach this last branch as well. Let's move it over to this surface and get it on top of it and then move it along. Let's rotate it. And perhaps rotate it in the Y as well. Okay, so now I have a kind of branch with some twigs. The next thing I'm going to want to do, so here are all of my surfaces. I think I will group these all together. So group is a wonderful way to have what's called a null object, which is just an empty object, but we can put things into it. So to group these together, I can go to Edit Group, or I can hit Command G. And now I've created a group, so I'm able to select all of these nodes, or all of these objects all at the same time. I'm going to rename this. I'm going to double click and I'm going to name this branch. And here I'll double click and I'll name this tree. I'm also going to grab my circle and my curve and go to my channel box editor, and I'm going to hide those, hit 0. So now this is a really clean scene, and this is important. It's something that I'm going to be looking for in your project to work, to make sure that you are maintaining a really clean outliner, and we only have the objects in our scene that are necessary to our model. Okay, so let's do the same thing now with our branch. And you see, once I've made the group, that my pivot is back here, not in the right location. So I'm gonna, because I had originally had on snap to grid, and now this is in directly in the center of one of the grid points. Let's turn off these other snapping functions. I'm gonna move the pivot, right? I hit D, I select my object and hit D, and now I'm gonna move the pivot back where I would like it, and hit D again, and it turns off the moving the pivot. And now let's select this, and let's make sure we have snap to curve or point here and let's pull this object on top of our tree, and now it's snapped. And I'm going to rotate it. I'm also going to scale it. I'm going to scale it in I'm going to hit this little square here to scale it in both directions, scale it up, and maybe move it up my tree. And so now this is a question of just aesthetics at this point, and I'm going to start to duplicate. So now I can actually, maybe instead of just duplicate, maybe I'll duplicate special. So I'll edit, duplicate special, just to create a bunch of forms. Maybe I'll do 8 copies. Let's just rotate it around that first point rather than translating it, although I can maybe translate it by 1 up the tree, just to get us started. And I can also rotate it. So let's rotate it. Let's rotate it in also with relation to Y. Let's see what that looks like if we rotate it 30 degrees, duplicate special. Okay, so now I have these branches that have been generated. Maybe that's too many, but what I can do now is just start to move these around the tree to see where I'd like to position them. Rotate. And I want to make sure that I'm selecting the whole group, right? Not just an individual surface. So let's move this here, maybe down, maybe rotate. Another, so a better way, rather than snap to curve or point here, let's actually snap to live surface. This will make our job a little bit easier. So let's select the tree and then enable snap to live surface. So now everything that all the movements that we do, these should to snap directly to the tree. And I'm able to kind of just drag my branches around the tree. And I'm going to be selecting my groups in the outliner rather than selecting them again, I'm going to select them in the outliner rather than selecting them in my viewport, so that I'm making sure I'm selecting both the branch and the twigs. And at the top, you know, they're a little bit smaller, so I'm going to start to maybe scale them down. Hit R and scale, and hit W and move. And R to rotate, just rotate this around. Okay, so I think you're getting a sense here of how to build a tree, or this is one way to generate a kind of organic form, and that's what's wonderful about curves. Curves really allow you to, and especially, or surfaces, really allow you to generate fluid-looking objects. Okay, so I think that we'll leave it here for this tree. There's a lot more I can do to make it look more realistic. Maybe this needs to be. Let's see if I can scale it again in these directions. Although now I'm going to have to pull my. And I might want to actually have tapered this tree, the top of it. But what I'll do is just make sure that all of my branches are snapped. Go back through one by one, snap them to the surface. Now there's one last thing I'd like to show you before we finish for this first video. The next set of videos for this week I created 3 years ago, but they really introduce you to all of the tools for modeling. So we are gonna, I'm gonna have you watch that series. There isn't too much of a difference between Maya 2018 and Maya 2022 when it comes to modeling. So it will show you everything that you need to know, that series. Okay, so maybe a couple more. Snap, snap. This one snapped, and that one is snapped. Okay, so I have my tree. The last thing to do is, let's ungroup all of these by edit and ungroup. And now we will select all of our, let's turn off the snap. And now let's select all of our surfaces. And I'm gonna go to modify. I'm gonna create a polygon object from my curved surfaces. So like I said, sometimes, curves are wonderful to generate forms with. They're not so great for 3D printing or for exporting as models into any number of applications. They're fine for rendering. But if we want to generate forms with surfaces, and then we want to convert them into polygons. So I'm going to go modify, convert, and I'm going to say NURBs to polygons. And let's look at our options here. So we have the options of generating quads, which I'm going to choose, or triangles. This means how many points are we generating a model that has four-sided faces or 3-sided faces. And then I'm going to just go ahead and let's reset the settings. Okay, so all of these kind of stay standard, but then I'm going to go ahead and hit quads, and I'm going to say tessellate. Okay. And now I have a number of NURBs to polys. Let's move them so we can see the difference. Okay. So now I have my NURBs tree, and I have my polygon tree. What I'm going to do, this will be my first how to edit a mesh, is to go up to mesh, and I'm going to just combine these. Now you see all these transform nodes. So now I've generated my form. It's all one mesh, but I have all these transform nodes. So again, edit. So to delete those, edit, delete all by type history. We'll get rid of all of those. The next thing I want to do is take all my surface objects, edit, let's group them together. Let's rename this NURBs tree. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this off, visibility off, and then I'm going to rename this poly tree. Maybe I will go ahead and move my pivot down to the very bottom. Let's stop the grid here. So that it's somewhere near the base. Hit D again. I'm going to move this tree back to the origin of the scene. Okay, and now I have my one polygon tree that I generated from NURBs curves. Okay.